I stand here today
on an island in the middle of the mighty Mississippi,
clear-eyed about the fight ahead.
to declare
these words.
that
I am a candidate for president.
I'm running for president of the United States of America.
President of the United States.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope that this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst our listeners, and I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share on your social platforms. For the next few weeks, we are going to begin a series that focuses specifically on the 2020 presidential candidates. Each episode will detail the candidate's personal and political life, all with the hope of helping to inform our listeners and beyond on each of the candidates. By promoting insight into each of these people, our hope is that each voter is able to make educated, well-informed decisions on who they'll cast their ballot for in the next presidential election. I also want to encourage you to seek out other outlets like mine to have a wider grasp on who these individuals are and what they bring to the table for you and your loved ones, because we all know everyone has implicit biases, myself included. Each episode will, of course, highlight our own personal thoughts concerning the candidates, what the country needs moving forward, and how this person could potentially impact our society holistically. Lastly, I want to point out we've chosen to highlight each candidate in alphabetical order instead of choosing who may or may not be a favorite of our own, in order to remain conscious of how our own bias can affect how the episodes are previewed. We also want to point out that while every presidential candidate running has different noteworthy platforms, we're only covering candidates with a somewhat plausible chance of winning the candidacy. Moreover, we also recognize that there are a multitude of candidates running for this position, which makes it impossible to allocate an episode to every candidate there is. However, if there's any candidate that you all feel strongly about that we don't make it to, please let us know by engaging with us on Facebook and Instagram. We definitely love hearing feedback from our listeners. With that, on this episode, we're featuring former California Attorney General, District Attorney, and Senator Kamala Harris.
Do you have an announcement you'd like to make?
I am running for president of the United States.
Senator Kamala Harris of California. She is a newly declared candidate.
Miss Kamala Harris.
Well, Kamala Harris captured the spotlight while campaigning.
I look forward to seeing you in Oakland and on the campaign trail. I'm running to be president of the people, by the people, and for all people. It's up to us, each and every one of us. So let's remember, in this fight, we have the power of the people. We can achieve the dreams of our parents and grandparents. We can heal our nation. We can give our children the future they deserve. We can reclaim the American dream for every single person in our country.
As a child of two immigrant parents from Jamaica and India, Harris's background is no stranger to academic excellence and the ability to engage in social and political movements. Her mother, raised in southern India, completed her undergraduate degree at the age of 19 and then came to UC Berkeley to pursue a PhD in endocrinology. After completing her studies, she was supposed to return to India for an arranged marriage, but but instead became involved in the civil rights movement, which is how she met Kamala's dad, who had immigrated as a young adult to study economics at Berkeley. Harris's extended family also were engaged in politics and social movements, being that her grandfather was active in the Indian independence movement and a high-ranking civil servant and advisor to newly independent nations like Zambia. Her grandmother, although had an arranged marriage at 12 and then married at 16, used her upper caste status to advocate for less advantaged women. For Harris, she grew up in the midst of the civil rights movement, as well as attending rallies and demonstrations. She lived a multicultural life, constantly traveling from India to Jamaica, and at one point living in Canada while her mother studied breast cancer. After Harris completed high school in Montreal, she attended Howard University, where she double majored in economics and political science. Her father taught economics at Stanford, while she began her tenure at Howard. At Howard, she became engrossed in politics as she became the freshman class representative for the Liberal Arts Council. She was on the public debate team, joined Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and began youth mentor programs while demonstrating against apartheid. She started her public service career as an intern for Senator Alan Cranston and as a press aide at the Federal Trade Commission. After graduating Howard, she began law school at the University of California, Berkeley. While many expected her to choose a path of criminal defense work or civil rights, she chose to become a prosecutor instead, which she even acknowledged surprised herself too. She claimed that growing up in the Bay Area and seeing the impact of law enforcement on disadvantaged communities propelled her to want to use the law to protect those most vulnerable and correct power imbalances. She first began her law career at Deputy District Attorney in Oakland, where she quickly gained a reputation for being tough on gang violence, drug trafficking, and cases involving sexual abuse. She focused specifically on cases with victims being abused because as a high schooler, one of her friends came to live with her after disclosing that she had been sexually abused by her father. She even told the New York Times once in an interview that when she was prosecuting child molestation cases, she was as close to a vigilante as you can get. Then, as her career began to take off, she became the district attorney of San Francisco in 2004, becoming the first ever woman to hold the office and the first ever African American district attorney in the entire state, which I personally think in some ways amplifies the idea that even these progressive states like California still have a lot of work to do. As the district attorney, she developed a program with the San Francisco Department of Public Health to help emergency rooms spot signs of child abuse, and she co-founded the Coalition to End the Exploitation of Kids. She also worked to create San Francisco's first ever safe house for children escaping sex work and San Francisco's first ever environmental justice unit, which sought cases involving illegal dumping and air pollution. One of her more notable pieces of policy was her Back on Track program, which allowed first-time drug offenders to receive a high school diploma and a job instead of prison time, which I say is very, very progressive. And while her tough on sex crimes attitude earned her praises from some, her contradictory work with the Catholic Church earned her criticism from others. When she became district attorney, her office inherited cases that had been working closely with survivors of sexual abuse that would pursue cases against priests and employees of San Francisco's Archdiocese. Harris was first met with contention when the district attorney before her believed that the clergy's record of abuse should be made available to the public, but Harris refused to do so. As she held the office for 7 years, her office didn't proactively assist in civil cases against clergy abuse and literally ignored the requests of survivors' access to their investigative files that could have helped them gain justice against their abusers. One survivor specifically said that once the transition From Hallinan to Harris, as district attorney became evident, his access to the office was cut off and his requests ignored. He ultimately ended up resorting to picketing outside the district attorney's offices and handing out flyers. Other survivors that sought the records and wanted them disclosed to the public claimed that Harris didn't want to step on the toes of the Roman Catholic Church and wanted them just to move on from it. While I cannot disagree with them either, because even the former U.S. attorney from Northern California thought the records should be made public because they were credible allegations, not just for accountability, but for the victim's healing process to begin. Transparency amongst our public servants should be a main component of their service if they're truly going to be advocating for the lives and dignity of those who are often ignored or overlooked. And we honestly see here firsthand that Harris failed majorly in being transparent with these victims and the public of San Francisco, which resulted in a lack of accountability being given to these predators, which honestly, we see a lot happening in our criminal justice system, especially when it comes to holding the church accountable. We see more misconduct from Harris as the DA when she supported higher bail amounts for gun-related charges because she believed it to be a public safety issue. Public defenders and defense attorneys argued that this bill would disproportionately affect poor people, because it would. And her rationale for the bill was that criminals were traveling to the city to commit crime because the punishment was cheaper than in surrounding counties. One of her presidential spokespersons claimed that Harris was responding to an increase in gun homicides and illegal guns in the city. Harris has now since backtracked on this at the national level by making reducing the burden of bail a part of her presidential campaign and Senate tenure. She even introduced legislation with Senator Rand Paul to encourage changes or an overall replacement of the cash bail system, which requires people awaiting trial to put up a specific amount of money to be released from jail. While I can't personally speak to what prompted to her change of heart now, I'd be remiss if I didn't call out the damage she did inflict as district attorney, whether it's calling her out for literally ignoring the victims of sexual abuse to advocating for a piece of legislation that literally was keeping poor people in jail. This is not a sign of progressivism in any facet, and it needs to be addressed, period. As she began her run for attorney general, a scandal hit her district attorney office that was a threat to her campaign run. One of her top lawyers emailed another colleague that one of the crime lab technicians was becoming unreliable and allegedly took home cocaine from the lab, which possibly tainted evidence and then raised the legitimacy of other cases handled by that crime technician. Harris, alongside her colleagues, didn't inform defense attorneys of this problem, even though there are rules and laws which require each side to do this. Harris responded that the police, in fact, failed in informing the other side of this and claimed that only about 20 cases would be affected by this, and argued bias because the judge was the husband of one of the defense attorneys. But chaos ensued, and Harris ended up dismissing literally over 1,000 drug-related cases because of the mishandling of evidence. Many of these cases had already had sentences attached to them. This fiasco weakened Harris's polished and efficient image and raised questions on her management skills. Harris still insisted that the crime lab was run by police, but did take responsibility for some of the failures, claiming that her office didn't have any written policy on informing defendants on problems with evidence and witnesses, although it's literally required by the law to do this. So I personally, as someone who wants to study law, I feel no empathy for her in this. Everyone knows that, or at least people who are engaged in the law or want to study law know that. Another law regarding truancy, which she was the driving force behind, also gained disapproval. She claimed that the goal was not to threaten all truant kids' parents with prosecution, but was meant to be a step-by-step process of escalating intervention and consequences to push parents to get their kids to school. However, while no one has so far been jailed, the threat of jail time still remains, and fines for this can run up to thousands of dollars. Many progressives advocated against this policy, as they should have, because of arguments that it was contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline by criminalizing these parents. More so, this legislation adversely affects low-income households, especially because many of them can't afford to make ends meet, let alone pay hefty fines imposed by the state, or they can't afford the possibility of going to jail. Imposing this type of policy also does little to actually remedy the actual problems that kids face that prevent them from attending school. Jyoti Nanda, who runs a youth and justice clinic at UCLA, claimed perfectly that this issue goes deeper because it fed into the rhetoric of the criminalization of poverty. She argued, cautioning that she didn't believe that this was Harris's intent, but it further reinforces those stereotypes that poor parents and parents of colors just don't want their children to go to school, that they're not motivated enough to send their kids to school, which is absolutely true. Policies like this, whether they're good intended or not, negatively affects marginalized communities. Police groups also showed her no support in her run for Attorney General, being that in 2004, she refused to seek the death penalty against a man who shot and killed police officer Isaac Espinosa. Even Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein called for the death penalty for the man. However, Harris refused to budge, being that she didn't personally support the death penalty. Although the officer's death was clearly a tragedy, Harris held strong to her position, and for that, I find admirable because of my personal opposition to the death penalty. Lastly, her handling of California's 3 strikes law. Harris was arguably ahead of the time. Under this law, someone who committed a third felony could go to prison for 25 years to life, even if that third felony was a nonviolent crime. But Harris required that the San Francisco District Attorney's Office only charge for a third strike if the felony was a serious or violent crime. Despite all of this, Harris was successful in her Attorney General campaign and became the first African American and Indian woman to ever become the Attorney General out of any state, ever. She expanded her Back on Track program to other parts of the state as Attorney General. Once the Black Lives Matter movement began, she introduced the first of its kind training to address racial bias and procedural justice. She made the California DOJ the first statewide agency to require body cameras, although that's kind of iffy because at first she was like, no. She launched Open Justice, a platform that allows the public to track reported killings by police officers. During her time in office, she was a trailblazer in other ways as well, in particular with her attention to technology's potential for victimization. In 2012, she sent out notices to app makers reminding them of California privacy laws and warning them that her office would pursue penalties should they fail to comply, which she did do so by prosecuting one man who ended up being sentenced to 18 years in prison for his revenge porn stunt. She also played hardball during a multi-state suit against 5 major banks accused of improper foreclosure practices during the mortgage crisis. Despite feeling major pressure from the Obama administration to accept specific terms in the midst of the suit, she refused to do so, because she felt it didn't bring enough money to California. Ultimately, she is triumphant in not accepting the terms because she secured $20 billion in mortgage relief for her state, as well as the right to implement financial penalties if the banks failed at holding up their end of their financial obligations. Now, while all of these different platforms reflect an attitude of hopefully trying to remedy her poor policy choices regarding criminal justice reform as district attorney, she still made a lot of questionable decisions regarding other policies during her time as Attorney General. Her office fought to release fewer prisoners despite the Supreme Court finding that overcrowding in California prisons were so bad that it amounted to unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment. The lawyers at her office claimed that they wouldn't do so because they didn't want the prison labor population to deplete. Yet, Harris claimed that she had no knowledge of her office going with that rationale until the media reported on it. She received criticism when her office argued against releasing an innocent man, Daniel Larson, from prison despite being found innocent by the Innocent Project. Her office claimed that the deadline for petition to be released had been passed, but a judge overturned that decision and released him. Again, Harris and her supporters claim that she personally had little to do with these cases. Yet, it's quite evident that even if she didn't, there still should have been more involvement or at least overseeing of how these decisions were being handled amongst her office. Despite her innovative legislation on police anti-bias training, she overlooked and defended police officers accused of misconduct. She resisted a bill that would have required the Attorney General's office to also investigate police shootings. Lastly, one of her biggest failures as Attorney General stands to be refusing to dismiss the case against George Gage. Gage was an electrician with no priors until his stepdaughter accused him of sexual assault, and her testimony essentially convicted him. The judge later found that the prosecution withheld exculpatory reports that indicated that the stepdaughter had a problem with lying to law enforcement, and her mother explained that she had always been a pathological liar. They also pointed out that Gage had been forced to act as his own lawyer, which led to the appellate court to send the case to mediation, which was an obvious indication it should have been dismissed. Yet, Harris wouldn't dismiss it, and his sentencing of 70 years was upheld. He still remains incarcerated today. There are other several cases in which Harris could have chosen to seek justice for underserved communities, but didn't, and will have to face these well-deserved criticisms during this presidential campaign season. After her stint at Attorney General, Harris became California Junior Senator as the first Indian American senator and the first African American senator from California. She tried to resolve her spotty past on criminal justice reform by her bill with Rand, which is now a part of her presidential platform. She also introduced the first ever anti-lynching bill, which would make it a federal crime alongside Cory Booker. Although it passed unanimously in the Senate, it failed in the House. She signed onto a marijuana bill and voted on the most significant federal criminal justice reform to pass through Congress, the First Step Act. As far as her presidential run, Harris supports the Green New Deal and Medicare for All. She announced a plan to give the average teacher a $13,500 salary increase, which would be a major win for educators because they definitely deserve higher pay. She introduced the Lift Middle Class Act and the Rent Relief Act, which are extensions of an earned income tax credit and tax credits to help with rent. She would replace the 2017 Republican tax law with Lift. She supports decriminalizing sex work and proposed that states be required to have clear new reproductive health laws that pass through the DOJ if they want to criminalize abortion. One of her biggest plans of actions she claimed that she would take if she were elected president was, within the first 100 days, if Congress failed at passing common sense gun control laws, she would do so as an executive order. Now, despite Harris's rise to political fame as being the first African American and Indian woman for many different facets, she has earned herself a widely known name, whether it's been thought of in a negative fashion or positive. Personally, her voting record was not at the forefront of my personal thoughts towards her when I first heard of her. After seeing her announce her campaign for president, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't excited to see a woman who looks like me vying for the most powerful seat in our country. Yet, her past remains clearly problematic, angering, and disheartening for me. For someone to claim the idea of progressivism and change, her voting record and policy implementation holistically reflects the complete opposite. I know she'll be a great debater when it comes time because of her prosecutorial past, yet I hope she has some damn good explanations and apologies for her poor criminal justice reform measures. I think that while many are encouraged to see her being highlighted so significantly in this race, others are still worried and weary, as they should be, of her jaded past. Only time will tell if Harris is truly remorseful for her troubles as district attorney and attorney general.
Hey, it's Kamala Harris.
She's a rising star in the Democratic Party.
The most sort of Obama-like hype around her.
Possibly your next president of the United States.
Last week, Senator Kamala Harris finally made it official.
I am running for president of the United States.
Well,
And
The California Democrat is trying to position herself as a reformer who works tirelessly to correct the abuses of the criminal justice system. But the senator has one big problem: her long record as a law and order prosecutor. Harris's new memoir, The Truths We Hold, makes no mention of her past as an old-school drug warrior, a defender of dirty prosecutors, and a political opportunist who has made life more dangerous for sex workers. Harris doesn't apologize for her previous stances, even those she now disavows. Instead, she's decided to try and convince voters that she has always been a progressive prosecutor.
How do you reconcile your contradictory past with what you claim to support today?
I've been consistent my whole career.
Here are some of the stories that the senator is hoping you'll forget in the run-up to 2020. Harris's political rise has been propelled by a years-long, high-profile campaign against alleged sex traffickers. What she's actually done is throw women in jail for having consensual sex, while trampling on the rule of law to advance her own political ambitions. Ignoring the pleas of sex workers and human rights advocates for over a decade, she's fought against campaigns to decriminalize consensual adult prostitution in California. As Attorney General, she created a statewide program to get truckers to report suspected sex workers to police. These policies didn't stop traffickers, but they did land plenty of sex workers behind bars.
One of the greatest offenders is Backpage.com.
Harris fought to destroy Backpage.com, a classified site that sex workers use to find and screen their clients, even though she publicly admitted that the site's founders, Michael Lacey and James Larkin, were protected from prosecution under federal free speech laws.
But tonight, a groundbreaking arrest.
But a month before Election Day in her Senate race, Harris went ahead and had them arrested anyway, parading them before the cameras on pimping charges, which were then promptly dismissed by a judge. When Harris got to Congress, she kept up her crusade, becoming a big proponent of the 2018 law known as Sesta Fasta.
One cannot cowardly sit behind a computer committing their crime. Quite the contrary.
The result was that many sex workers had no choice but to return to the streets, where soliciting clients is considerably more dangerous.
It's because you don't know who's going to pick you up.
There's more pimps and there's more guys out here.
Meanwhile, Harris declined to intervene in a real underage sex trafficking scandal that involved dozens of police and other local authorities in the Bay Area.
America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I knew this history well, of innocent men framed, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants.
Yes, and during her time as California's top cop, Harris contributed to that history repeatedly, by going to bat on behalf of dirty prosecutors. Her office appealed the dismissal of a case in which a prosecutor had fabricated a confession to secure a conviction and fought an appeal in a case where a prosecutor had lied to the jury during trial. In 2015, Harris tried to stop the removal of the Orange County District Attorney's Office from a murder trial after it repeatedly failed to turn over evidence to the defense. Her office even tried to keep a man in jail who had been wrongfully incarcerated for 13 years after a judge ruled that he had proven himself innocent just because the man hadn't delivered that proof quite fast enough. And as San Francisco DA, Harris hid known misconduct by a crime lab technician who admitted to deliberately tainting evidence.
Did prosecutors working under you know about the concerns about that lab?
The prosecutors
which is what the judge alleged.
Did not know about it, at least said they did not know about it.
The debacle has since led to the dismissal of hundreds of criminal cases.
Something else it's past time we get done is dismantling the failed war on drugs, starting with legalizing marijuana.
Your opponent, Ron Gold, has said that he is for the legalization of marijuana recreationally. Your thoughts on that?
That he is entitled to his opinion.
Harris is a former drug warrior who is now refashioning herself as pro-legalization. That's a positive shift, but not a reason to rewrite the past or ignore the patterns it reveals in her judgment. For years after the cultural tide had turned in favor of criminal justice reforms, Harris continued to support lock-em-up policies that disproportionately hurt minorities. As California Attorney General, Harris opposed marijuana legalization as late as 2014, promoted civil asset forfeiture without a conviction as a way to fight drug rings, and sought to more aggressively police prescription drug use. In her new book, Harris reveals that her drug warrior mentality hasn't changed. It's just that her emphasis has shifted.
We also need to reinstate the DEA's authority to go after the major pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors, and we need to invest resources in law enforcement efforts to cut off the supply of fentanyl from China. Let's believe in a more perfect union without mass incarceration of African American men. We put more people in prison than any country on earth for no good reason.
Yes, we do. And once these people were in prison, Harris saw to it that they'd have a hell of a time getting out.
I absolutely believe there should be severe and serious consequence for violent crime, which is why I've prosecuted those cases, and will always seek the highest sentence.
As a prosecutor and law enforcement, I have a huge stick. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy.
Before her recent about-face, Harris chose not to endorse proposed sentencing reforms on the California ballot in 2012 and 2014, and she defended the constitutionality of cash bail until 2016. Harris's office also fought an order to reduce California's prison population after the Supreme Court determined the conditions amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Although she later claimed to be shocked by what they had done, Harris's attorneys argued that nonviolent offenders should stay behind bars because the state needed the cheap labor they provide.
We are part of a longer story, and we are responsible for how our chapter gets written.
As she blazes her path to the White House in 2020, Kamala Harris is trying to rewrite her last chapter, but her record remains.
Our children and our grandchildren will ask, at that inflection moment, where were you? And what did you do in service of your family, your neighborhood, your community, and your country?
It's also important to note that Harris, alongside South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg and former Vice President Joe Biden, are all being heavily courted by the big banks and major Wall Street businesses. They are receiving the bulk of Wall Street funding and have fundraisers every single day. This is misaligned with the new Democratic tendency towards grassroots fundraising, spearheaded this year by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Other major candidates accepting this form of funding include Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke, and Kirsten Gillibrand. Not to say that this form of fundraising is entirely bad, as major businesses have the deep pockets to affect political change. It just makes it more complicated when heading into these primary debates, when these candidates have to appease an increasingly left-leaning Democratic Party. Personally, Harris cannot run from her past during this campaign. She has to own her mistakes, as she has consistently apologized for on the trail, and propose measures that can potentially remedy the harm that she has caused throughout her tenure as a public servant. Politics is tough, consisting of a lot of compromises and tough choices, with many outcomes unknowingly hurting those that these leaders want to protect. Harris is a powerful speaker and has received strong support from donors and the public at large. Her challenge, moving on to the debate stage, continues to be owning her mistakes and allowing us to understand what she plans to implement as president to remedy these mistakes. I hope that this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listened and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that Kamala Harris's past and her impacts on systemic reform causes you all to be engaged with how our current candidates have been politically involved since they first emerged into politics. While I hope she can somehow turn it around, I personally believe that all public officials, no matter how prolific they may be in some ways, are still responsible for being held accountable for their actions and their impact. Harris may have a jaded past, but that doesn't negate all of the positive aspects of her career and her presidential run today. However, they cannot go unnoticed either. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Linico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French,